changing? Is it because like the inequality changing is because you have like more shocks, either micro, macro, meso shocks, or the ability to cope with shocks becomes like smaller and smaller? We are currently doing like risk assessments and coping mechanisms, and try to look in terms of to what extent the formal and informal mechanisms crowding on each other, whether they actually support each other. One of the preliminary findings shows that there are a lot of informal mechanisms, but it's a very small part, that it will not be enough to address, to be a coping mechanism. Similarly, also the formal mechanisms are also too small that it will not really affect ability to cope with shock. Another thing that I would like to get more is that you are saying the upskilling offset much of the driver towards rising inequality. Maybe, if I'm not mistaken, it means that the increase of the educations. But the increase of educations is very much depends on like where are the increase of the education in the distribution. For example, if we look in Indonesia situations, the return to education is a convex function. It means that the increase of education, like if it is uplifting everyone get like 1 more years, it will actually increase inequality instead of like decreasing inequality because of like the winner takes all phenomena. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that we want to make like all the return to education to become the same. That's not really or making the return to education for the higher educations become smaller. That's not really the main issues. What I really would like to get the discussions, maybe like from the audience also, the fine-tunings on the recommendations. Like you mentioned about reforming tax and benefit system, boosting employment and career, investing in human capital. There is a need of like to dig deeper, especially in Indonesia situations, to understand better reforming tax and benefit systems. In what way? What do we mean by should we focus on ikan-ikan besar, the big fish, or should we like the small ikan-ikan sedang, like the one that are actually much more numbers of like big fish? The tax base is very small. And then this is very much linked to the STSN discussions, for example. Where should Indonesia go in terms of the STSN? Indonesia is have a lot of the STSN is the right things to do, the pertinent thing to do, but at the same time you also want to make sure that you got the right filter in terms of like devising the type of benefits, and so that it will not have like an impact on the fiscal later. But that's something I think that on the tax and benefit systems, it's really a need to dig deeper in terms of like where should we go. Similarly, on the social assistance part, Indonesia do have like Mira, you've already mentioned like some of the social assistance program in Indonesia. It's create a building blocks, but far from being a comprehensive house that help us addressing with all that kind of shocks or addressing inequality. Where should Indonesia go in terms of like reforming those social assistance systems and integrating those social assistance systems? Similarly, on the boosting employment and career prospects, the difficulty is at 90% is that working on SMEs. But at the same time, if there's seemingly a ceiling for the SMEs, those SMEs 10 years ago were also SMEs. What are the kind of things that we can do in terms of addressing the SMEs issue? Similarly, on the employment protection legislation, on one side we know that we like workers need protections, but at the same side you also want to make sure that it's that labor markets will create more jobs. How to make sure that having the grand bargaining strategies that address some of like, the issues of low workers protections but high rigidity on the from the regulation. Also investing in human capital. This is like, something that Indonesia already set aside 20% of the budget for education. but it's not only about the number, but also like the quality of spending. The dilemma, we see the dilemma in terms of like high unemployment rate is actually coming more from the highly educated people. But at the same time, the firm survey shows that there is a difficulty of getting the right type of people. So investing on what kind of educations and investing on what kind of boosting employment and career prospects, this is something that I think that we need to discuss. Of course, it's a big job, and this is something that we can discuss further. I think that's on my side, but we can talk more on there.
Thank you, Vivi. Let's move on to Yumna.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. Thanks a lot to the OECD and NATSA and SMERU to have me here as discussant. Secondly, I would like to say that this report is very valuable. I think it's a very good and comprehensive overview and analysis of poverty and inequality and its trends over the last 20 years. And something that I especially like of the report is that it puts a spatial perspective to this phenomenon in Indonesia. First focusing on the decentralization process, but as well in its analysis of regional inequalities between provinces, but as well districts. And my task here is a bit to explain about the challenges that some of the social assistance programs that are operating in Indonesia are facing, and to give you like some flavor of those challenges and some ways you might think of how to address them in the near future. Okay. Maybe the next slide. Now it's working. Now it's working. So about Yumna, maybe two important things to mention. Mira already mentioned this cluster structure. There's as well this PPLS data set, this central unified database, which is already used for a few programs like PKH, Raskin, and partly as well for Jampesmas and BSM to select recipients. I'm talking about some of the experiences during this short discussion. And the relationship to the report is Timbuk has a focus on poverty, and everything that reduces poverty automatically reduces inequality, because in the end you try to make the poor better off, closer to the middle of the expenditure distribution. So maybe on the background, we have this huge decentralization process that Mira already talked about, and in this slide you see the increase of Kabupaten quota over the last 15 years. So we started in the early 90s with less than 300 of them. Until now, the process has not yet stopped. We are still in the creation of the process. We are more of 500. An important feature of this is that, in contrast to many other countries, the districts have a very strong role compared to the provinces. A lot of the tasks and a lot of the money is directly linked between the national government and the district government. So the cooperation and the capacity of the district is a very important factor in affecting how well all these programs are implemented in Indonesia. And besides this very crucial link to the district level and the capacity of the district level, there's as well something that comes clearly out of the OECD report. And one is, for instance, the poverty rate. You see a lot of variation, not only across provinces, but as well within provinces. These are district poverty rates, so you see even in Java, like some areas with very low poverty rates, very high poverty rates, and the same pattern in Sumatra. And while ARPA looks pretty red, there's a lot of variation as well between poverty rate being just 20% or being up to 50%. So, and as well in the OECD report, for instance, there's as well in the decomposition of the tile index, one of the main findings as well that a lot of the inequality, overall inequality in education is actually driven by variation within districts, even within the same province. So we have a setting where districts are very important, but we have a lot of variations. Districts can be very, very different from each other. And maybe to relate this spatial pattern of districts a bit to how social assistance programs operate, it's maybe good to, a good example is PKH. PKH is a conditional cash transfer program for very young mothers or women who are currently pregnant or lactating. And this idea is basically borrowed from a lot of developing countries, especially in Latin America. You give young mothers a certain financial incentives to get vaccination and at a later stage bring children to school, and this helps to break this intergenerational transmission of poverty. It has about 5% of the social assistance expenditures in 2013 are budgeted for this. And the program started in 2007 to work in about 350 Quechua mothers. By now, it has a very uneven expansion process. So there was additional 440 in 2009, an additional 394 in 2011, no expansion in 2012, and there's a stronger expansion coming in 2013. When you look at the spatial pattern, how this program has been rolled out, and this is quite an example for many social assistance programs, we see, and these are the blue dots. The blue dots are largely here based in Java, a bit as well here in North Gorontalo, but otherwise it was a very modest rollout in the beginning. It has then increased in 2008 largely to cover a bit more here in northern Sumatra, as well a bit more on Java, and it started first as well a bit in Kalimantan. In 2009, basically no real expansion happening. In 2010, a stronger increase, and in 2011, a bit more. But what you see as well, this program doesn't operate in many areas yet. As well, the expansion process is pretty uneven. We see we're starting first maybe in some of the major cities or the rural areas around these cities. In that sense, there's a lot of spatial inequality where actually these programs are operating, and this as well is valid for a couple of other social assistance programs that operate at a much, much smaller scale. And of course, from an equality and equity perspective, you would like to have these programs operating actually in other areas and all or much faster. So what are maybe some of the reasons behind this expansion process? And there are good arguments as well why you have it like that. And I brought now 3 of these arguments. One is maybe there's a pilot argument. You want to test it first. You want to see what are the problems. Once you have seen the problems and fixed them, you expand it to other areas. So this is a very plausible argument as well. There's a cost-limited budget argument to some extent. Delivering services in remote areas might be very expensive. The cost of transfer might be as 3 times as high as doing it maybe in Jakarta or Bogor. So if you have limited budget, you might ask as a policymaker, why not maybe providing 3 people in Jakarta with it instead of 1 in the Locus. Yeah? But there's as well a readiness argument. If you wanted to implement it everywhere at the same time, maybe some districts are not ready, and if you would wait very long until maybe all the districts are ready. So why not just start where districts are ready? So all of these arguments are somewhat valid, but it still doesn't that still shows some of the problems that we have. We face definitely some infrastructure problems to deliver these services in certain areas, but we as well have a very slow expansion process. Some of these areas clearly are ready, but the budgeting process is and the commitment is rather slow for having a high upscale. For a couple of programs, the coverage rate is small, and they always start in the same pattern. So we have like 4, 5, 6 programs all operating here, while none of those programs might operate in the Moluccas and Papua, in certain parts of Kalimantan or Sumatra. And that is clearly far from optimal, and there has to be, there's more work needed on that as well to have a quicker expansion process to these areas, in the upscaling of some of these programs, and as well in the spatial dimension that other areas are covered as well by these programs. And another maybe example on the spatial process is related to a lot of the studies that we know from the academic literature or from World Bank publications, which have pointed out that to have an effective social assistance program that really addresses the issues of poverty or inequality, really must be sure that it's working properly in certain fields. Some of the problems that have been pointed out is sometimes it's mentioned that there's a certain level of corruption. There's these studies from Benjamin Olligan on Ruskin in the Journal of Public Economics. There are different documentations of leakages, that program benefits don't necessarily go to the poorest in certain areas. And there has been recently a lot of work, especially by JPAL and as well the World Bank, on maybe having what kind of best targeting mechanism might be used that balances local levels of satisfaction, as well as maybe targeting accuracies that the benefits go to the poor. And we have a lot of non-compliance with the program criteria. What this means, I just illustrate a bit in a minute on Ruskin. So a lot of these problems are seen as a local level problem. So the national level has a good idea, and there's the poor household, but somewhere in between in the delivery of these services, a problem occurs. That might be at the village head level, that might be at the district level, at the sub-district level. Maybe something goes wrong there. That is sometimes the feeling that is that one gets when reading these reports. And there's definitely some evidence on this available. Recently, there have been a couple of initiatives by the government actually to break this link at the local level, to see, okay, if something was wrong in this process between the national level and the household who's actually supposed to receive it, why not strengthening the household and giving him maybe some sort of a guarantee that can receive these benefits. And this has been the main idea behind something like KPS, the Social Protection Card in 2003, the BSM card pilots in 2012, and the change of the Ruskin list. And as well as the central targeting database that is sold. Maybe just to briefly explain, the KPS is basically a card goes to the family, and then with that card you can go to an office and basically demand your benefits. That's basically the idea. The same with the BSM card, which goes to students. The same idea, the family receives it and then goes to the office to really have this entitlement. Yeah? So there's no school principal or no district office in between anymore to determine what is the level maybe of the benefits and how much you get. Similar with the list of Ruskin recipients, I'll talk a bit in a second, where basically a list was sent out to the community with the names of recipients who should receive it, and these lists were supposed to be installed somewhere at the public place in the community. So basically that those who are listed really can demand the right to get the right amount of Ruskin and the right amount of prizes. So all these ideas and dimensions somehow follow this idea to strengthen the bargaining power of the household. Now, to come a bit to the example of Ruskin, there are different things already mentioned. The program should have a low price of Ruskin of 1,600 rupiah per kilogram. Now everybody should get, who's eligible, 15 kilograms, and in 2013 this should even happen 15 times a year. And it's a quite large budget post of the government. In fact, a lot of more people get that. There's a lot of equal sharing in a lot of communities of Ruskin, as we know. There's a lot of problems in the observation that its distributions have been less frequent. Sometimes the quality of the rice might not be so good, and sometimes there's much more charge on that. And there are other studies showing that somewhere, according to the rice that is bought by the administration and that is delivered to the local level, somehow some rice might disappear in this process. There are like different things where people have worked on Ruskin. So in 2012, there were two reforms that are important to keep in mind. One is there was a general reduction in the quota of Ruskin, on average 20% for all districts, depending on the district, a bit more or less. But that's quite a substantial amount. The other one was this posting of names and addresses with this list, which was the idea. Okay, you have the name there; it's publicly placed. This gives the household the right to go to the distribution point and demand the kilograms. Now, this is now preliminary results from a qualitative study on the implementation of this list, these posters of these names, and this. Basically going to 22 locations in different areas of Indonesia, and from these 22 locations, actually only 4 locations follow this pattern of posting this list. Yeah, there were 5 locations were a bit inspired by this listing system, but used completely their own list, and 13 used no list at all. Similar to the 15 kilograms of distributions, only 7 actually distributed these 15 kilograms, and all of the 7, sometimes it was more on depending on very different criteria. So this is not maybe so surprising for some people, but maybe one of the interesting things is why communities state why they haven't complied with that from that study. And there were different reasons mentioned. One is they actually don't know how to explain to the local population how these lists were made. So they felt they didn't have enough information to give them a good reason to believe that these lists are true. A lot of people stated that they even did not know that Ruskin has a poverty focus. For them, they perceived it widely as a program that goes to the community and that is shared somehow among the community. There's as well, especially in this context of the reduced quota, that some said, well, some people felt they should have got it, maybe. They felt, especially in this context of quota reduction and tensions, they don't use these lists because of these things. And in general, there's sometimes very little knowledge of very specific but important things on this. So what we learn about that is something as well that we have to respect from the national government. We have these capacity constraints at the local level. And we are implementing a lot of reforms with very good ideas and purposes and objectives, but given the limitations of the district capacity as well, we have to acknowledge that we have to prepare a much better information and communication strategy on these programs to equip the districts as well with the necessary tools to be able to implement actually these. The problem with this is that all these other studies on what might be the problem of leakages and corruption always takes into account that these people are well informed, but they deviate somehow from this behavior. But we as well, to really make this inference to something, we really must make sure that people understand the objectives of all of these programs. And there's as well some tasks, and we are trying for a lot of these programs now to improve communication and information strategies on that, to as well increase how these programs are really implemented at the local level, and usually, although not necessarily, poor districts might be less able actually to have this capacity to implement these programs in a way it's due. That's basically already all for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan, for your insights into how it will work at work. The third discussion, Athia, please.
I don't think I want to add more comments than to previous distinguished discussion. But actually, I'm really happy that finally more research, more papers coming in front of us about the inequality, not only the poverty reduction, but also inequality. And I'm more happier than to see the paper on Indonesia. So for Pak Micheal and Mira, I would like to say congratulations for both of you. Because these two papers, I think, provide a very comprehensive picture of inequality, but not only from trends, how the inequality growing in both in Indonesia or in other countries, but also these two papers also find out the drivers of the inequality and also last but not least is the policy relevance of the research. Also, besides on Indonesia, the paper on Indonesia complemented with the review on disparities between regional and provincial indicators. So it provides more views, more enlightenment to us on how inequality affect more of people in Indonesia. But then I don't want to add, just want to add some additional comments, I think, because Vivi has raised many comments earlier, many significant and comments earlier. I just want to emphasize what can we learn from the other countries to be, replicated in Indonesia. Like from Micheal, it is said in the report that redistribution through tax or transfers become less effective in many countries in OECD in mid-80s to 200s. But why it still become your main policy recommendation? And then on Ibu Mira's presentation, it seems that from the agricultural sector become a caution during the crisis for Indonesian people, but then seems shattered after decentralization. Do you have any idea what is happening? And also for growth elasticity on poverty is the magnitude of this elasticity is higher after decentralization. Is it, somehow a good thing for us, or do you have any explanation for this? And then for Micheal, for the policy lesson we have from the OECD countries, we know that Indonesia is more 70% people in Indonesia working in informal sector. So is there any lessons again from the OECD on how to increase formal employment? Because this is like a cycle. We have huge informal employment, and then we don't have any good tax base, and imply to another policy response to this. So I think if we want to want to cut the cycle, and then we have to find what is the age of this cycle, whether it is formalization of the economy or the other factor. And then also related to that, many debates between the union in Indonesia and with the business people as well as with the government is still, I think it's still at the surface. They still have huge debate on whether wages can increase in Indonesia. But this is also have main other implication. because the market, the labor market distortion and other factors. So how to shape better employment policies is vital for us in Indonesia. Again, because Ibu Mira pointed out about the decentralization and also the balance between decentralization and universal quote-unquote national policies on social assistance and also on poverty alleviation programs, we come to like a dilemma how to balance this. I think the discussion from the audience also will be beneficial for us. Like for our study on the Jakarta, on the local health financing, district seems very reluctant to, to go to the next BPJS, the health BPJS. Yeah. So this is kind of we don't want to go to step further, but then how to accommodate all these stakeholders. And last but not least, I'm really happy that policy recommendation, policy relevance for this study highlights the importance of inequality and poverty studies. So people like in SMERU and other institutions like us would still very relevant for this station for the coming years, especially after 2014. I think that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Athia, and thank you, Vivi and Jan also. I think Vivi gave us a lot of homework. I think they are not apply only to Micheal and Mira, but to all of us here class. Therefore, I would now like to invite comments or questions, maybe for the first round from 4 people, and later Micheal and Mira can also respond to the discussion points together with from the audience. So I see Pak Arif, Pak Satis, Pak Firman, Pak T, and Pak Andi. All male, that's not the sign. Okay, let's start from Pak Arif.
I have a few comments. First,
Maybe you can introduce yourself.
my name is Arif. I'm from University. First comment is to the first presentation. I think inequality rising is not necessarily a global phenomenon, because if we think that way, it may make us think that the source of our rising inequality is growth. I think this meant in Indonesia. Why so? Because not all countries experience inequality rising. Latin American experience declining inequality, and if you read the ADB report, less than half of the country reported in the report only less than half, right? Experience rising. So that's the first comment. The second one, I missed the energy subsidy. Because I'm advocate of the subsidy. I think one of the policies that will reduce inequality is to reallocate the subsidies. 100 trillion rupiah compared to only 50 trillion rupiah to social spending. And I think that Indonesia is perhaps the only country where the rich actually receive, not receive the transfers from the tax because of the subsidy. And also, I disagree with one of your paragraphs saying that in 2005, 2006, the property increased because of the rice price as a result of the subsidy reform. I think it's because of the low export, rice export ban that happened in 2005. So I disagree with that paragraph. And the other one is labor market. I think labor market is simple. And you have the table where it shows that the informality is stable for the period, but our study which distinguishes the formality and or informality into top 20% or top below top 20%. But for the last 10 years, the access to formal labor market is increasing only for the top 20%. For those people or the top bottom 20%, the access to formal labor market is slowing down. So the more and more poor people are denied access to better the labor market. The last one is I shared the result of the effect of inequality on poverty in the regression analysis, because if you examine the growth incident curve before during Suharto era and during the Reformasi era, I think it's not a taboo to say that this is Suharto era, this is Reformasi era. You think it's a taboo, it's fundamentalism. So if you examine the incident curve during the Suharto era and the Reformasi era, you can see that the slope of that growth incident curve is a lot steeper during the last 10 years, and in such a way that the bottom 40% growth is lower. It's lower than the previous era. It's lower. When it's lower is that the inequality of course will be properly reduced. So that's, I think, explain the economic result of the study.
Thank you. Athia.
Thank you very much. My name is Athia and I work for a firm for strategic Asia. I have a number of points, but I'd like to start with how things have changed in the last 10 years. 10 years ago, if you talked about inequality, it was almost as if you didn't care about the poor, that there was a feeling that it was kind of false consciousness almost. Now the concern seems to be more and more with both poverty and inequality, so I'm very happy to see that. I have a number of comments because we've also been doing quite a lot of work in this area. The first is really on the measurement issue, which Vivi also brings up, and the OECD report, and so on. And I think one of the things we could all benefit from is if we do some simulation exercises by simply widening the consumption basket that is actually used for the consumption estimates. Because we did that several years ago and found that the Gini coefficient jumped quite dramatically from 0.32 or 33, whatever it was, to close to 0.5. If you only introduced some of the middle income consumption into the basket. And I think that it would be very nice to see what changes are affected purely by the nature of the consumption basket itself. I think the second broad issue is decomposition of inequality. Now, because we have, of course, higher index and that index and whole series of indices, it's very tempting to keep decomposing inequality because we get very nice statistics out of it. The question is, what results are we getting and what policy impact does it have? If we are looking at, let's say, the result that was produced in the indices, and we find that a very large part of the poverty is within districts rather between districts, not so much between provinces and so on. I think we need to actually then try to understand what that exactly means in terms of policy. And one of the things we probably need to do is to recalculate that data at the village level. Because one of the issues clearly that's being debated in all the public service delivery debates is that the unit of decentralization for public service delivery and programs like that should be even lower. The Indians, for instance, actually passed an amendment of the Constitution 20 years ago to actually initiate village government as a unit of government. The problem was that it was almost impossible to devolve power from the states to the village level, and the whole series of governance issues. So I think once we actually decompose, we need to actually understand what that data is telling us. Another point I think which we have been working on a lot is that, like the poverty estimates, we tend to bring out data on inequality almost as a monitoring of how the government is doing. You know, in the old days, you had all kinds of poverty estimates, and not one measure of policy was actually linked or triggered to the numbers that you were getting. And the same issue comes here. How much inequality, as expressed by the Gini coefficient or any other coefficient you may want to estimate, is actually acceptable before policy triggers actually come in. Are we really talking about a situation where we should all be like Denmark? You know, do we have a national agreement on that? Do we really understand, as Vivi said, what kinds of inequality are we trying to reduce and why? That debate is sadly missing, and I would very much like to invite friends to work with us in promoting that kind of debate. Because without that policy trigger, we simply going to get lots of nice numbers and not be able to link it to a specific government overall policy. My last 2 points are one, which is that while we see policy Gini coefficients rising all over, we also see the number of policy instruments that governments can use actually shrinking. For example, in the 60s, the big debate was not about, you know, how do we promote education alone. It was land reform. It was asset redistribution. It was progressive taxation. There was an ideological agenda to it, the welfare state. Now, in the period of globalization, there's almost an assumption that that redistributionist agenda is no longer available. So what you do is promote social mobility on the one hand. So all the pressure falls on education. And that's also very difficult, because education almost at the high levels by definition is unequalizing, is a meritocracy. On the other hand, we also don't seem to have devised any clear instruments for dealing with inequality, except to say we will promote poverty reduction, and somehow by doing that, we will reduce inequality, which is really not the case, as you say, in the case of the United States and others. My absolutely last one, is that in much of this discussion, we are not somehow seeing the major structural changes that are actually going on. We are not linking this to the rate of urbanization, for example. Indonesian rate of urbanization is very high, and then seeing how that affects poverty. We're not linking it to the master plan, 6 economic corridors and so on. We're not linking it to the fact that the first infrastructure investment of that phase, inequality may rise very sharply, as is done in many parts of the Mekong Delta. And we are not also linking it to the new opportunities that are there in ASEAN post-2015 for sharing resources, sharing ideas on how to reduce inequality. So thank you very much, and thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much. I'm Nicola from Slovenia. I have a couple of points, and I very similar to other commenters. So the first one is the fact that what we see is the fact that inequality is everybody's agenda, everybody's policy agenda. But for me, and the first presentation by Mr. Forster clearly show why we should care about it. But what is not clear to me is whether we really need a different policy. So this is also mentioned by Vivi to address that, particularly in the case of Indonesia, where we have very limited capacity to do any kind of redistribution. So for Indonesia, I think the policy, which probably should be still poverty alleviation and social assistance, and we need to track inequality, we need to monitor them, but probably not so much of really creating policies specifically to address that. So I see we are already opening the debate on inequality here, which I think is sorry missing. So, and in terms of taxation, my suspicion is we probably be taxing rich, and this is just speculative. Taxing the very rich would probably put a big dent on poverty as opposed to broadening the base, and it's probably more costly administrative. The second point is on the gap figure, the gap that was showing there, showing that the correlation between the high degree of inequality and the low degree of income stability. And I wonder how much is it, and these people have already raised each question about this, how much is it depend on actually, how much is it was an artifact of variation within the group. For example, you can imagine a country where a lot of people are very homogeneous, a lot of people have similar skills, similar education, and what happens between generation or between years is of their income depends a lot on the variance. And you will observe from year to year that a lot of people switch places. And you will say, oh, they have a higher degree of mobility. On the other hand, you probably observe a country where there's a lot of heterogeneity. And you will not see this high degree of mobility, even though there's nothing different in the process within the country. It's just an artifact of the variance within each of the unit of analysis. Thank you.
My surname is Tay, T-H-W-E. Don't pronounce it as T because of everything I'm not good. I have a few remarks and questions. First of all, the increasing inequality in income is due to the increasing inequality of assets, both physical assets as non-physical assets. That means education. And so I totally agree that you should give more scholarships to poor students. Moreover, as I said, the income inequality data are based on expenditures. It's much easier to get access to obtain data on expenditures and on income. And income is based on assets, physical assets. And I think whatever their dedication, it's very difficult for the people from the CBS to enter, to knock at the door of all these gated villas, because there are so many anjing galak, barking dogs. So that's already a shortcoming in data. With regard to non-physical assets, it's clear, just looking at, and I'm the economist and the economic researcher of the University of Sciences. I am quite sure that these Pusuruk, their children would have the same possibility as the researchers. So more scholarship should be given. Because we always pride ourselves on our abundant natural resources. Also, our abundant natural resources are now rapidly declining, particularly our forest resources, because of deforestation and so on, because of poor governance. So what we should do is actually have a better idea how to get what better data. And I think the increasing inequality is just a part of capitalism. In socialist countries, or whatever there is, inequality was rather equal. That was, of course, before China became a capitalist country. Furthermore, so we should get a better data on assets. And that's not so easy. But without better data on the assets, physical assets, it's very difficult to get a more income. Finally, I think there are three aspects, or two aspects, to inequality. First of all, there's the gap between Western Indonesia and Eastern Indonesia. Western Indonesia generates about 80% of GDP. Eastern Indonesia only 20%. the government should pay much more attention to allocate more resources, education facilities, and funds to Eastern Indonesia, the Eastern and Western Nusa Tenggara, the Alatas, and Papua, as you already showed. Second aspect of inequality is urban-rural disparities. And it's certainly true what Michael Lipton said about the urban bias. In, I think it was almost a little bit more 15 years ago, there was an NGOs presented a paper at the conference in Johannesburg, South Africa, in which he showed that the difference between urban and rural areas were 2 to 1. Whereas she also showed that the difference between the capital city and the rural areas was 3 to 1. I should show there's not only an urban bias, there is a pronounced capital city bias. And you see Jakarta. Because all the rich people who have cars, not really rich, you know, I'm middle class. Maybe lower than I have a little car. Our life is bothered by all these traffic jams. So what's the government doing? They are all driving flyovers. So that an enormous amount of capital, of funds spent on all these flyovers, toll roads, you know, to make our life more comfortable. Would it be more spent better on these Eastern Indonesia provinces? And we should also, the government should also spend much more funds on providing scholarships to poorer also. There's already a program, but it should be intensified and extended much more. Only in this way can we become a more equal country. Thank you.
Andy.
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentations. My name is Andi Panjaitan. I'm working at Alatas at the Poverty Reduction Directorate. First, I would like to ask to Ibu Mira, on your presentations, perhaps I didn't really catch about any relationship between the implementation of the government poverty reduction programs and the issue of inequality. Perhaps as Ibu Vivi from the World Bank has mentioned that maybe you could elaborate more on the integrating or reforming social assistance to reduce inequality. And the second, also, when you presented the provincial Gini coefficient, you mentioned about the high poverty and high inequality issues. Could you elaborate more on what the cost for the high inequality, that in the regions such as Papua and other regions in Eastern Indonesia have? Other than the thing that you mentioned about the creation of new districts, perhaps maybe because of the new industrial businesses entering that regions, or any wage disparities, or job creation. The last question is for both speakers, for Michael and Ibu Mira. The same with the previous questions about urban inequality. As you see, like here in Jakarta and other big cities in Indonesia, we have the rising of middle income class. So do you have some inputs maybe from other OECD countries on how they implement the government programs to tackle about the urban inequality? That's all my questions. Thanks.
Thank you. I think the discussions and the audience have raised so many important points. Now I will give the opportunity to the speakers to respond to this very general terms, because we don't have enough time to discuss in detail. So maybe each 5 minutes. That's fine.
Looking slides, but that will fine. Next is
very useful. Thanks also for your feedback. Extremely useful also. At the very start, I should make perhaps what we missed at the beginning, to make about the setting. Because these two reports are not, they are related, but they are not part of the same package. So this big report, Divided We Stand, we published 2 years ago. It was on OECD countries. It was trying to really explain the causes of increasing inequality in the OECD region. Within the report, with a special focus on emerging economies. This special focus chapter is analytically not linked to the other chapters for 2 reasons. The first reason is conceptual issues. The issues are different. The issues are very different in the big emerging economies than they are in the OECD countries. Take globalization. The discussion about the effect of globalization on the labor market, say, in Europe or in the US, is very different from the discussion on how globalization impacts on the distribution in emerging economies. So this is not the same analytical point. The second point is data. And I will come to that, I hope, very quickly, because both the concepts but also the data measurements are different. I don't say that the data is something, they're different. And that's why I've shown at the very beginning 2 panels for inequality levels. One for the OECD countries, where we have, in the last 30 years I was part of this process, we have established a standardized measurement for measuring income inequality in terms of household disposable, adjusted disparities. And this took 20 years to come to this. And I've shown a second panel for the big emerging economies, and I've shown you the results for Indonesia, where it can go from 0.21 to 0.55, depending on which measurement you use. So that's, I think, very important that we cannot put things together which, as you say, are incomparable. The point is that in this special focus chapter on emerging economies, here we want now, this is the second part of the process, and here the Indonesian study steps in. For each of the countries, we are doing now an in-depth study for the country. Before we go on comparing apples and peanuts, so we had a study on South Africa, we currently have a study on Brazil, we have another study on Indonesia, and once we have processed these in-depth studies, then perhaps we can go on and compare things. So it's important to say at the beginning, which I perhaps missed. Let me take perhaps the most important points. Well, in terms of, but this is still linked. In terms of policy recommendation, of course, if you put it very, very general, the point was both redistribution and inclusive employment policies matter, but this is very general, of course. But this is very different if you, and we have in-depth recommendations for each of our member countries, but also for Indonesia. There's a study on Indonesia which goes into details and looks at education policies, for instance, and how to better allocate certain funds. But I mean, this is not part of the overall guidelines, so to speak, but they do exist. An important point, and let's start perhaps with the more philosophical points. Which part of inequality is acceptable or how can I say, or inevitable, as you put it? It's not straightforward, because there's the works of John Römer, who in the last 5-6 years tried to disentangle this. And he came up pretty similar, 30-40% of inequalities he is estimating for Latin American countries, by the way, so to speak, are not linked to personal characteristics. But this is a very, very contestable framework also. There were studies recently, because the factors where you say, what is your own choice? Did you go to university, your own choice? Depends. Depends on also whether your parents give you the scholarship and so on. So in this framework, for instance, education, your own education is something that you choose. Do you choose it really? I don't think so. It depends. And there are other studies, now more recent ones, I forgot his name, Andreas, something, the IZA, who used the same framework, but he came up with something like 60 to 75% of the level of inequality, which is not controlled by yourself. So it's very different, 30 or 65, 70%. But still, it's an important issue. It's not 100%, I agree. But it is somewhere between 30 and 75%. That's another important issue that you raised is, there's consumption inequality, income, and wealth, of course. All three matter for the functioning of the economy and for the distribution of resources. They do not need to go the same, but depending on the statistical measurement, for the time being it's mainly India and Indonesia who were the main concepts based on consumption. Income is the main concept for most of the majority of OECD countries and also emerging countries. But your wealth is important. I don't think it's linked, but there are studies on wealth inequality in Indonesia, and they show that it's after, I think, Switzerland and some other countries, the third highest concentration on the top. If I come now to data, I think you're overly pessimistic. I was yesterday with UPS, with Riyana. They also have the same concerns that you have. They say, we cannot interview these rich guys, or we have misinformation from the very poor people who don't use information. It's true that, don't forget, we have exactly the same problem in Turkey, in France. We have the same problem in France. You will never, ever get statistical information on the, say, top 0.5%, except with tax declarations in a functioning system of taxes. But knowing that you have good information on 95 to 98% of the population is at least what it's right? And let's not overdo it. Yeah? We have very good data in OECD countries, and we simply need to exploit them. There's a lot of income information, which remains unexploited, which can be exploited, as has been shown by some of your colleagues. So that's important. Sorry, I'm talking too long. You just told me if I speak too long. I will try to make a few comments. The other one was on redistribution. Of course, this was the point that redistribution of tax and transfer, it was bottom line for OECD countries, because welfare states redistributes 1/3 of the inequality, right, which is important. As I have, I don't know whether I've shown, in the Asian Pacific region, redistributive capacity is 10% of it, it's much, much lower. But let's not forget, I mean, what I did not show is the level of investment in social, in both taxes and transfers in Indonesia is pretty particular. It's at the same level as Pakistan and half of the level of China. So there is something which can be done to increase the redistributive capacity of state policy countries. That's at the beginning of it. And for the time being, there are other policy priorities which Jan has underlined very well, which I think are very important. I have so many things to add, but let's say, what is, for the second point on to which extent inequality is safe or is unavoidable or safe, and the second point is to which extent is acceptable or so on. It also pretty much depends on the history and the culture of the country. If you make a single scatterplot, you ask people, do you think inequality in your country is high, too high, and do you think government should do something? And then on the other axis, you've got the actual inequality. It has zero correlation, zero. You have countries where inequality is high, and people say, I don't care, it's in the US, for instance. You have countries where inequality is low, and people think it's extremely high, and you should do something against it, Austria, France. And so, and of course, policymakers, they are more, for them, it is more important the perceptions about the resources, how the resources are allocated in a country. More, I mean, they are as well interested in it than in the actual Gini coefficient. So this has to be taken into account when you do policy programs. I very much like the presentation how Jan mentioned. One point I have here, and this is about when you said one of the outcomes of the qualitative study was that the local community said, well, actually, know that this was a poverty, this was a program targeted for the poor to decrease poverty. But this raises a more general point about targeting. Because on the one hand, you need a pretty well a system which remains at the end of the day pretty well targeted. On the other hand, you have this, the same programs targeted to the poor have tendency to become poor programs. Why? Because not everybody benefits from them, or not the middle classes, basically. And you have a number of, and if you look at OECD countries, you have a number of examples where programs simply were phased out because they were too well targeted. If a whole program goes only to 1% or 2% of the population, strictly, then you lose a bit the support of the middle classes who finance these programs. And then suddenly this specific, very targeted program for single parents in one of the OECD countries said, well, because it can also work. So there's a balance that one has to achieve. I think it's your example in these policy programs between very well-targeted outcome and remaining the support of those who finance the support, so increasing actually support to increasing tax and payment.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much for all the discussions about, really comprehensive feedback and comments, and then we will take into account. And then also for the discussion, so I think it's really encouraging that we share the same interests and that we can also learn from each other. So I just would like to touch a couple of things. I guess a lot of discussions about directed towards trying to disentangle what are the policies for poverty reduction, what are the policies to reducing inequality. And then I think this is it's really, I guess it's really complex, and this probably will be our homework, because I think even from the government itself, I haven't actually seen really, really specific formal statement. Okay, these are the policies to reduce inequality. I mean, what is different from poverty. And I guess this, for example, from the result itself, right? I mean, from when we did the estimation for the gross poverty and inequality of poverty, and then the result shows that it is indeed that increasing the average living of standards for people, I mean, increasing the consumption growth is which have an impact on poverty, but the distribution actually not okay, because then it's actually offsetting the impact to the poverty. And I guess looking in the paper itself, something that I haven't actually touched is we actually did also analysis looking more than absolute poverty only. So we also try to examine the relative poverty, which is to some extent actually looking at the distribution and the characteristic of people. And then from that analysis, we actually show it shows a lot of the cases of unequal opportunities, like Vivi already mentioned. Then also we can understand more what are the characteristics, and then we did a comparison what the characteristics of the people in the bottom 20% of population comparing to the remaining of the consumption distribution. But somehow also, like, my question is, when you look at try to understand the people in the bottom of the distribution, then what are the benchmark actually? Which characteristic that you want to achieve? You want to, you cannot ignore like the remaining, the 4 or 5 of the distribution, because then, yeah, I guess, do we want like to be at the top, everyone? I mean that's also like the question that we need to ask, like, do we want to be an average? Do we want to be more? Or all these kind of things. I guess is I think this probably can be also the input, like to the policy makers as well, like when they develop policies that they may need also to think about what we have discussed. What is the inequality that is still good? What is the inequality that is probably not really good for development? And thanks a lot for Andrew's comment about that growth incidence curves. I think this is actually confirming that looking from different approach, then we actually have the same kind of results. The other thing that's probably I would like to touch is I really like the spatial dimension of your policy discussion. I guess the question is also that you have like some you actually elaborate about like several points why then not every district have the capacity to implement that social assistance yet. So I guess it's probably, I don't know, maybe like to you probably develop, we need to know what are the priorities of that, which one that you need to tackle first, because then like some of them probably, given that you have, for example, you touch on budget, you cannot do anything about it if it's already given. So I don't know, maybe like from that side itself, I think it's I mean, my question of view, I would like to see like the priorities. And then yeah, it's really interesting about like some the recipient also doesn't know about like what is the target of this social assistance program. Maybe like for the going forward, I'm not really sure whether is it possible for us to put, like, for example, some kind of like a question like in the Discussants or something, whether like to know just to assess the awareness of the recipients. I know that in Discussants they actually ask about whether they know about the health insurance case, something, and then yeah, I think it's really hard that if the recipient itself doesn't really know what is the program, and then yeah, I think it's really hard then also to really improving the distribution if people itself doesn't really know that they are actually eligible to receive the program. And the other thing that probably I would like to touch is from Athia about the agricultural sector. This is not that saying that agricultural sector is really like not important anymore. I think it still play a role. I mean, not playing a really important role, particularly for absorbing employment in rural sectors. And then I guess I remember some kind of a discussion as well. It's really important to increase the agricultural productivity and things still, and it's something that's probably not really touched at the much probably nowadays, because there has been probably more focus on the role of the service sector. I mean, like as the fuel of the employment. I think it would be really good that if we also look back to also observe what's happening in the agricultural sector, and then like the point that's been up Service Minister about, like, for example, like increased productivity, like about the land redistribution and everything. I think this is something that is a really important issue. For Part2, yeah, I really agree with all your points. One is really, really important, and then about the division about region, Western, Eastern Indonesia, urban, rural, inequality. This is the things that we have actually discussed in the report as well, and then it's something that I don't know. I mean, when Eastern Indonesia can catch up, but I think yeah. But I guess some of the positive point, I guess, from the presentation and from the report itself, we kind of see. Of course, I mean, it takes a while. If you, maybe you would say, never gets right, but for me, like, there has been like some catching up phenomenon, for example, from the poorer provinces, in terms of reduction, which is probably you will argue, maybe because the low, for example, the more developed provinces, probably because they have this experience diminishing, because they already, for example, in terms of poverty already very low, and it's really hard to push down. But then this is, I don't know, somehow I think as Indonesian we need to be more optimistic about what's happening. So I'm trying to be okay, if something like good news, like positive, like okay, I'll be happy about it. So at least there is some progress, like being made in like those really challenging issues. I think that's probably all. I think my comments. And thank you so much for everything.
Thank you. I think this has been a very interesting discussion. Unfortunately, when I look at time, we already run out of time, and we have to move on to the next session, the concluding remarks. From me, I think the conclusion is that inequality is a complex issue. But the good news is there are things that you can do here. In general, Micheal mentioned that redistribution and inclusive development policies are the way to go, but that's very general. The specific thing that we can do, we have identified today, I think, I mentioned about energy subsidy. That's, I think, a big network for any government in Indonesia to reform. I think that's a time reform. Tax reform, mentioned, we are always been a low paying tax country for a long time. We want to change, I think, in the future. Improvement in program implementation, we know this for a long time also, and we just have tried many things and nothing seems to really work well. I think that and also in general, we have to improve the quality of our spending, government spending. You mentioned specifically for education sector, but I think it applies to almost all sectors. I think that's my concluding remarks. Now I will invite Micheal and Mira to give the final word, if you have any.
Very few sentences. No, just apart from thanking you all very much for feedback. I think three general ones. One is several you mentioned that it's a bit new, seemingly, that the issue of inequality is discussed at the same time as the issue of poverty reduction. Who mentioned this 10 years ago? This was almost perceived as a contradiction. And I think this is developed not only here, but also in the discourse of OECD membership, OECD member governments. Because there used to be a time when what is important is to reduce poverty, and if we can even increase the quality, the best quote is Tony Blair, who said, I don't care if there's some workers having 200 times the income of other people, as long as I reduce child poverty. And it's not as simple as that. There is a relation between inequality and poverty. And I think one of the big, very, very interesting results from Euro studies is that you look in the 80s and 90s in Indonesia, the growth elasticity of consumption and the elasticity of income inequality both work in the direction to reduce poverty. But this has changed in Indonesia also in the last 10 years, where you still had an impact of growth to reduce poverty, but which is partly, not totally, but partly offset by increasing inequality. The point is to design our policies to prevent that this offsetting effect does not become stronger, and to leave room for inclusive policies. Yeah, I should leave it here. Once again, thank you.
I think I'm just like, you have already summarized and concluded I just have one more thing. I guess always that question is about which better policies for poverty. I'm just talking about poverty because inequality, I think we have decided that we need something more. But if this is about poverty reduction, right? Which one is actually better? Do we want to have more universal policies, or do we want to have the social assistance as well? Because both are really interrelated. I guess it's for example, if we look at the social assistance, right, and then with our plan to have the universal health insurance coverage, but then we cannot actually move from the universal policies as well, because what we have been observed, to get an access to those systems, you need supporting infrastructure and everything. If for example, is from the surplus side, for example, it's not really strengthening. So it's not really strengthened. In terms of the amount of in terms of health insurance, for example, number of doctors or number of puskesmas or something, then it will be really difficult for those who are not who are eligible to receive this to access that. So I don't know. I mean, it's been really, I think, a huge shift for the towards the social assistance. I think in decentralizing period, but I think it still also need to have also universal policies as well. So need to really both of them needs to be also working together. And I think final thing, I'm really thankful for everyone comment and feedback. I guess I learned also a lot because you are here. I mean, and you are all really expert in dealing with the fields as well. It's really going to be encouraging discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Micheal and Mira. We are broadcasting this event using live streaming, and we have been accepting questions through Twitter. That's why I have been checking my mobile from time to time. I wasn't playing with it. But so far, the questions that we have received through Twitter are just asking where we can download the report. So we will allow that. So finally, thank you once again for all of you who have participated in today's event. Now we would like to invite you for a lunch. We have provided the lunch at the dining room in the back. You can pick up your lunch and bring it back here, and we can have more discussion informally. I will formally close this event. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Ini bisa